Questions and answers on Aramaic, brought to you by JesusSpokeAramaic.com. So in this question and answer session, we're going to look at the family tree of Aramaic dialects and ask, is that family tree right or wrong? Are there any problems in it? So it's actually quite an interesting session, and it's a question I get asked quite a lot in one guise or another. So let's begin by looking at a family tree of Aramaic dialects. This is actually a slightly broader one of Semitic languages in general. So Aramaic and Hebrew are Semitic languages, along with other languages such as modern-day Arabic, etc. So at the very top of the chart, we can see Eastern Semitic languages, and that would include things like Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian. Actually, that isn't Babylonian Aramaic, that's actually a separate language. Originally it was called Chaldean, but it's different from Biblical Aramaic. Then in what some people might refer to as southwestern Semitic languages, you have things like Ethiopian, Amharic, etc., Arabian, and that's where modern-day Arabic kind of ultimately derives from. Obviously south, we're thinking of the Saudi Arabia, etc. So those are languages which arose in Saudi Arabia, crossing over to Ethiopia, places like that. They are still Semitic languages and they're related to other Semitic languages, but a different major branch of that family. Then we have the Western or West Proto-Canaanite branch. I kind of don't like terms like Proto-Canaanite or Proto-anything, because we don't really know ultimately that far back exact details of what languages were. But anyway, in that branch we have clearly here, according to this breakdown, Amorite, Eblaite, Ugaritic, Mesopotamian. We have Aramaic, and in that Aramaic branch, things like Nabatean, Jewish, maybe confusingly Arabic is apparently part of that, whereas before it was Southwestern. But then we get this sort of Phoenician branch where we have Hebrew, obviously the holy language, Samaritan, so the kind of language that the Samaritans spoke, and they have preserved the Samaritan Pentateuch. And then maybe not too good an example of a Semitic languages, but according to this, different branch, probably from Phoenician, Archaic Greek, Greek and Latin, and so on. So that's one person's perception of the overall story or family tree of Semitic languages in general, but just note that Aramaic and Hebrew are not that far away, and according to this breakdown, they're in the western branch of Semitic languages, as opposed to the way far east, like Babylon and Iran, Iraq, countries like that, as opposed to the south, so Saudi and Ethiopia, places like that, things like Israel, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, all that kind of area is Aramaic or Hebrew, or languages which are very closely related to Aramaic and Hebrew. So that's a really important point to bring out, that those two languages are still in that large group of languages in Western Semitic languages. But let's go on. Let's go on now to look at what Wikipedia says. Wikipedia is a good place to start. It's crowdsourced. It's obviously not perfect, no encyclopedia is, but nevertheless it's always a good place to start. And here, this is a chart from Wikipedia about Aramaic, and we can see that it's a Semitic languages, as we saw. It says here it's Central Semitic, Northwestern Semitic, and that kind of makes sense because in the previous chart it was a Western Semitic languages. But if you look at the subdivisions, it splits it into Eastern Aramaic and Western Aramaic. And that's interesting. So it says it's Aramaic as a whole is a Northwestern Semitic language, and the previous chart said it was a Western Semitic language. But now it's splitting up that Western language into an Eastern Aramaic and a Western Aramaic. So that's an interesting point in and of itself. But if we then click to find out what is meant by Eastern Aramaic and Western Aramaic, by Eastern Aramaic we have things like Classical Syriac, and the New Testament, the Aramaic Peshitta New Testament, is written in Syriac, and we also have Central Neo-Aramaic and so on. So according to this particular breakdown, Syriac would be in the Eastern Aramaic, not Western. But if we look at the Western Syriac Aramaic now, we get Western Neo-Aramaic, we get Samaritan Aramaic, we get Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. So think now of Palestine and Israel and Jordan. What this particular breakdown says is that those would be in the Western branch of Aramaic, whereas Syriac would be in the Eastern branch of Aramaic. So a lot of people would look at that, and indeed a lot of people have looked at those, what I think are quite simplistic breakdowns, because people love graphs and charts and family trees, and have said that there would be a problem there, because Syriac, according to those breakdowns, is an Eastern dialect, whereas Galilean Aramaic or Palestinian Aramaic is a Western dialect of Aramaic. So some people would say, well, clearly Jesus is in Galilee, clearly he's in Palestine 2,000 years ago, therefore he must have spoken a Western dialect, therefore it's not possible that Syriac would be the recorded language at the time, because these graphs and charts and family trees say Syriac was an Eastern dialect. And so many people just, at that point, close the book and say it is not possible that the Aramaic Peshitta New Testament would be the authentic words of Jesus in Palestine, because wrong branches of the family. One's a Western branch and Syriac is an Eastern branch. Therefore, the Syriac Peshitta New Testament, Aramaic New Testament, must have come centuries later. So I would challenge those ideas, and the reason I would challenge them is because I want to just lead you down a line of thought. Whether we know Aramaic well, another language that we do know well is English. So let's just try and think how we would draw a chart of the English language using those same analogy of Western, Eastern and everything else. If we were to do that, if you look at English and just try to quantify English into different branches or different dialects or different areas where it's come from, you would have to conclude, I think, I'm sure someone who's an expert in the history of English would maybe do things a little bit differently, but I would suggest most people would be happy with saying, well, we have British English. Canadians obviously speak English, unless they're French speakers, but they speak English, different language in some ways, different words, spellings maybe. Then we have American English, and American English can sometimes be a few embarrassing differences between British English and American English. Then we also have English that's spoken in the Commonwealth countries, in islands, for example. In the Caribbean, they speak English, but there are notable differences between the English of Britain and, let's say, the Caribbean. Also in Australia and New Zealand, English is obviously also spoken. So if we were to split up the English-speaking world, you'd probably start to divide things up amongst geography. And you could say there's Western, Eastern English, depending on where you are in the world. One of them's New Zealand, might be, I suppose, Eastern if you're from Britain. America would be the West, depends where you're looking from, etc. But in general, people would generally be happy in splitting the English language up into sub-trees according to that division. And in fact, if you look at word processors, you'll find separate dictionaries for all of those kind of different branches of the English language. And so if we were to draw that in a chart, again, I don't like doing this, do not quote me on this chart, but if you were, most people would generally be happy with the idea of British English coming first, and from British English, because remember, Britain spoke English long before America was colonized, etc. So generally, British English would have to be at the head of everything, because Britain came first. Then America, Canada, the Caribbean, etc., Australia and New Zealand, those English dialects obviously came later as people populated Australia and New Zealand. So generally speaking, normal people would look at this chart and say, yes, that's a fair breakdown of the way that English, you could split English up now into American English, Canadian, Australia, New Zealand, different islands like the Caribbean, etc. So most people would generally be fairly happy, I suppose, with a breakdown that was somewhat like this. It makes perfect sense. We've got word processors that split the English spelling into different languages and areas like we have here. So this is a chart that, generally speaking, would make about as much sense as the earlier charts we saw of the Aramaic language, splitting it up into Western and Eastern Aramaic. But I would challenge that when you actually start to look at the details, because that simplistic chart that we see here is actually very, very misleading when you start to look at the history of English. So I'd like now just to look at a few reasons why this chart is actually true in a sense. It's true if you look at English today, but it was very, very misleading when we start to look at the whole swathe of English down through the years. So let's just have a few thoughts about why this is problematic. First of all, those languages, just going back to the previous chart, in reality, they haven't really had British English as the start, and then they've all independently gone off to form all these different variations of English, because those languages interact with each other. So, for example, Canadian and American English interact with each other. Sometimes Canadian English is more similar to British English in terms of spellings, but Canadians also use a lot of words common to North America, which in Britain we would regard as American sort of words. So Canadian English, American English, British English, they kind of interact in ways that aren't shown in this chart, simply because for hundreds of years they've coexisted, they've commingled, people have travelled, and so just a simplistic chart like that doesn't take into account how those languages have influenced each other over hundreds of years. Equally, a chart in Aramaic doesn't show how those Aramaic dialects have influenced each other over hundreds of years, actually thousands of years in the case of Aramaic. Secondly, it doesn't take time and history into account. This is a huge flaw in these family tree type charts. For example, going back to the original chart of British English, this isn't actually how things happened. It's summarising possibly 1,000 years of the history of the English language in a simple chart. In reality, British English evolved over hundreds of years. We have Middle English, so Shakespeare came along in about the 1500s, and English was still forming as a language. Before that we have Tyndale and Wycliffe, and English again was still forming as a language in that formative time. When the Pilgrim Fathers went to America, they kind of took a snapshot of what English was, both as a spoken and written language, and they went to America and effectively evolved differently after that, which means that American English has adopted some of the original spellings of what the Pilgrim Fathers would have used. British English has evolved independently, as has American English. So it's very misleading, let's say, to assume that British English is the start of it all and everything simplistically split into nice groups according to British English, because it doesn't take into account that British English itself has evolved independently of, let's say, American English and Australian English. So history is being summarised in a way that obscures and hides and misleads the truth, because these languages have coexisted. British English has continued to evolve. It's actually gone in a direction that's different from Shakespearean English and the King James English of 1611. British English has evolved independently of American English. And exactly the same is true in the case of Eastern and Western dialects of Aramaic. It doesn't take time into account. Also, British English has changed over time. The spellings of English words have changed over time. For example, the King James 11 came out in 1611, and then there was a Blaney revision of the King James Bible in 1769, and that modernised all the spellings, or harmonised and modernised the spellings of the King James Bible, and that's generally the one that we use today, is the Blaney revision of the King James Bible. So British English has changed over time. Lots of words in the time of Shakespeare have gone out of fashion and aren't used anymore, and there's also a two-way street between American, Canadian and all the other forms of English. British English has adopted American words that even 10, 20, 30 years ago would not have been found in Britain. Those Americanisms are being adopted. and it's a two-way street. British words and phrases are adopted in America. So it's not accurate, it's not real to say that British English directly evolved into American English, because it's a more complex web of interrelationships. And that complex web of interrelationships isn't represented in a simple chart such as Western Aramaic and Eastern Aramaic. Those languages have evolved over time. They've all changed. American English has changed, spellings have changed, vocabulary has changed. Even within America, lots and lots of different areas speak English in quite fundamentally different ways. The Deep South, for example, English is spoken very differently to New York or Seattle or California. You can often tell where someone is from just from the way they speak English and just from the way that certain words are used. And the spellings of words are changed. So that simplistic chart of just saying British English divides into these nice categories doesn't reflect reality. It doesn't reflect the interrelated web of relationships between them all. It doesn't represent the two-way flow where things flow from one area back to British English again. It doesn't take into account history, where 1,000 years of British English has actually evolved and changed. Words have gone out of fashion, come into fashion. British English has adopted other words. It doesn't take reality into account. It's nice and simple, and in your mind you can get a kind of snapshot of English today, but it doesn't take reality and history into account. So the chart, nice though it is really fundamentally flawed when it comes to reality over time. For all those reasons there, it's not a good representation of reality, even though it's a good place to start. And so, coming back to the question of, is the family tree of Aramaic correct? Is it misleading? Is it right or wrong? Exactly the same arguments we've been making about the history of English, nicely categorizing it into American English, Canadian English, and so on. It really starts to kind of fall apart when you take exactly the same arguments, when you take history into account. Aramaic was spoken over a huge swathe of land from pretty much from, I suppose, Turkey, Israel, right over the way to Iran, Iraq, Jordan, even as far away as India. The disciple Thomas took Aramaic to India as early as 52 AD. So Aramaic, as a coherent language, was spoken over a huge swathe of geography. It was also spoken, for example, in the Bible already in Abraham's time. We have Aramaic spoken in Ur of the Chaldees. And so Laban, for example, when Abraham takes his family to Ur of the Chaldees and then to Haran, and Jacob goes back to Laban to take a wife, they speak Aramaic to each other. So Laban names the heap of stones with an Aramaic expression. So that's already in maybe something like 1800, 1900 BC. And then Aramaic continues to be spoken down through whole swathes of territory for literally thousands of years. So a nice simple chart like this of Eastern and Western subdivisions of a Northwest Semitic language is a really wrong, misleading simplification of what happens in reality over centuries, over millennia, over geography. It's a kind of snapshot of the way we would look at it today, just as that earlier chart of a snapshot of American British English is a snapshot of how we would look at it today. It doesn't take reality or time or history into account. If, for example, we look at the Eastern Aramaic dialects of Syriac, and so from this chart you would assume that Syriac, which is the language that the Aramaic New Testament has been preserved in, you would assume that it's an Eastern Aramaic dialect, and therefore, because it's an Eastern dialect, you wouldn't expect Jesus in Palestine to have anything to do with it. Eastern makes it sound like it's from Iraq, Afghanistan, or somewhere way in the Middle East, far away from Israel, or Mesopotamia, or Ur of the Chaldees, or Babylon, or somewhere like that, and therefore you would assume that it couldn't possibly be a language that Jesus would know or have heard of or could recognize or could speak. And yet the reality is that Syriac already in the first century, by the time of Christ, was a known vehicle. It was used. It's got literature coming out of that first century. Even before the first century, it started to flourish in a literary sense, as we've seen in our lessons on the Estrangela alphabet. And so there's absolutely no reason whatsoever why Christ, bearing in mind that the Gospels were intended for the widest possible distribution, why the New Testament could not have been written in Syriac, even though, according to this chart, it would be an Eastern Aramaic dialect. This is just a gross simplification of reality. And in particular, history gets lost in this time period. Here we have the so-called Western Aramaic dialects. And again, people would assume that Samaritan Aramaic and Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, falling into those, would mean that those are the dialect of Aramaic that Jesus would speak. And it may well have been the case, but equally, Syriac was the vehicle used to spread the gospel worldwide. Galilean at this time, we have very little in Galilean Aramaic. There might be a few inscriptions from Galilee and maybe a few letters that were found in Galilee at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt or something, but that doesn't mean that the vehicle that the Lord God would use to preserve his word through 2,000 years of the history following that time period would be in a small dialect that hardly anything has been preserved in. Let me ask you a question. If you were living in America and you lived in the deep south and you had a very, very strong characteristic accent that everyone in America would recognize as from the deep south, and you wanted to write a novel or a book or a history which you intended to distribute far and wide in the English-speaking world, would you write it in a really local, colloquial accent, or would you not write it in standard English so that it could make sense to the widest possible English speaker? I would suggest that's exactly what happened in the case of the New Testament. The pronunciation of words which Jesus and the disciples spoke may well have been noticeably Galilean, but the vehicle that God Almighty used to preserve the New Testament was in Syriac, because as the previous chart shows, Syriac was the vehicle lasting thousands of years over an immense area of time, and it's remained fundamentally unchanged as a vehicle to preserve the New Testament, because it was the classic spoken and written language over such a huge swathe of territory. Go back to those lessons on the Estrangela alphabet and the history of Estrangela to see just how widely spread Syriac was. So Eastern and Western Aramaic, unfortunately, those splits don't really take time into account. Nowadays we can look back with hindsight at Aramaic and maybe try and split it up into Western and Eastern dialects, but those dialects, that split between Western and Eastern, didn't really happen until about maybe the 5th century or thereabouts, when different alphabets and scripts start to be used. Certa script starts to be used in the West, and the Eastern script started to be used in the East, even centuries later. So that split between Western and Eastern didn't happen until maybe around the 5th century. At the time of Jesus, those splits just weren't there. There was Syriac as a spoken language, and the differences aren't really sufficient enough to make them a different language that would be mutually recognizable. So that split into Western and Eastern Aramaic in particular doesn't take the historical reality into account. Nowadays we might look back and split them up into Western and Eastern Aramaic, but at the time of Christ those differences just didn't exist in the way that a chart like this would indicate. So what's the conclusion? I would suggest that those divisions or family trees or charts which present things in a nice simple way, they're great just to get into your head the relationships between different dialects and different languages and Semitic languages in general, but they really do kind of not exactly lie, but they misrepresent the truth in quite dangerous ways when you start making assertions like the Aramaic New Testament could not possibly have been in Syriac because Syriac is an Eastern dialect. It doesn't really make sense because that doesn't take history into account. It doesn't take 2, 3, 4,000 years of Aramaic into account, where Aramaic was interacting in different parts of the world, different parts of the Middle East. It doesn't take the interchange between the dialects into account. It doesn't take the fact that God used the Syriac as a mechanism for taking his New Testament, the Word of God, into the widest possible audience. All of these things, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever why the Aramaic New Testament should not have been written in Syriac for the widest possible audience. That, after all, was the whole point of the gospel. It had to be preached to the whole world rather than a very, very localized Galilean accent, which we don't really have much evidence for in any case. Having inscriptions and a few letters, we can't really construct a whole language out of pieces like that. So going back to the question at the start, is the family tree of Aramaic dialects right or wrong? I would suggest that the answer is kind of wrong if you want to make it a definitive statement of East and West, and at the very least it's misleading in misrepresenting how history changes over time, how different parts of geographical parts interact with each other over time, how people interact, how language changes over time. It's a kind of snapshot with hindsight that you can look back on, and it's a good way to at least get a picture of how languages are related in your mind, but it's a wrong and misleading way to represent time and how things have changed over time. So hopefully that has been interesting, and it's let you see how the family tree of Aramaic languages is actually very, very complex, and we really need to understand the details of how languages have changed and evolved over time. And hopefully by looking at English and how English has changed and evolved over time, we can see that a simplistic chart splitting English up is kind of misleading over time in much the same way as splitting Aramaic into nice simple family trees is also misleading. But the main conclusion is that there is no reason why the Aramaic New Testament could not or should not have been written in the Syriac dialect of Aramaic, because Syriac, after all, was the most widely spoken dialect at the time, and the New Testament was deliberately taken to all the world as a preaching aid. So hopefully that's answered the question. This question and answer session was brought to you by JesusSpokeAramaic.com. To submit your question for consideration in a future session, fill out the form at JesusSpokeAramaic.com/contact. Be sure to visit JesusSpokeAramaic.com for step-by-step video lessons on the history and background of Aramaic, to learn the Aramaic alphabet in the Ashuri, Estrangela and Serta scripts, for biblical Aramaic, the Aramaic Peshitta New Testament, the Aramaic Old Testament and the Aramaic Targums. We offer a growing range of Aramaic DVDs, workbooks, study guides and meditational CDs on well-known passages of the Bible, books about Aramaic, a range of specialist Hebrew and Aramaic Bibles, and generally everything you need to study Aramaic in the context of the Holy Scriptures. JesusSpokeAramaic.com is a one-stop shop when it comes to learning Aramaic. Subscribe to get full access to the complete range of several hundred step-by-step video lessons, exclusive bonus material, and other resources that are available only to subscribers of JesusSpokeAramaic.com.